I am a free and natural person who is about to blow the whistle on a bunch of obviously corrupt and evil artificial corporate persons. You see, I don't really care what the corporate sponsored Supreme Court has to say about the humanistic qualities of corporations, because it was the Supreme Court who ruled in favor of granting the right to patent life itself to these government investment held corporations. And with more than 40% of the genes in my own body now patented by major multinational corporations, with genetically modified seeds and breast cancer now patented by Monsanto, and with the patenting of the very lifeblood that is drawn from our bodies and used in corporate pharmaceutical research, it is time to declare our freedom from this corporatist government before they patent our very souls. So let's take a look at some of these comprehensive annual financial reports. Let's go back to Delaware. Here on the Sunshine Review, we see the Delaware state budget for 2008 and 2009. Now remember, this is the taxpayer budget. It says, Delaware faced an $84 million budget gap for fiscal year 2009 as of February 2009. For fiscal year 2010, the budget gap was estimated to widen to $606 million. However, more recent reports place the fiscal year 2010 gap closer to $750 million. Amazingly, when we look at the budget figures, which shows general fund expenditures for fiscal years 2003 through 2008, we see that the tiny state of Delaware has increased its expenditures from $2.4 billion to $3.4 billion. And so in a 5 to 6 year period, the state of Delaware increased its spending by $1 billion? When we go to the section called Budget Transparency, it states that Delaware currently has no statewide official spending database online, despite multiple recent attempts to pass legislation which would require such transparency. So you must ask yourself, if a government is in the public trust and the public interest, how can they not be transparent? It also states that there were 32,600 people unemployed in February of 2009, compared with 17,600 in February 2008. So unemployment has almost doubled in Delaware, while government taxpayer-based spending has increased by $1 billion in the last 5 years. This coming from the state who has over 50% of corporations and over 60% of Fortune 500 corporations incorporated within their state. How can you possibly have any unemployment with that many of the nation's corporations? There ought to be a law. But not to worry, Governor Jack Markell will come to the rescue. Under his proposed actions, it says that the governor has proposed an expansion of gambling that would position the state as a Vegas-style destination. Curing the economy with casinos? In the first year, the sports lottery is estimated to generate $55 million in additional revenue. Additionally, with corporate and income tax increases, program and benefit cuts, and an across-the-board payroll reduction of 8%, Markell told lawmakers his plan would balance next year's budget despite a $751 million revenue hole. Now, before we look at the comprehensive annual financial report, which is the full accounting of all the money that Delaware has, this is just one example of the simplistic graphs that are presented to the public. A citizen's guide to the budget. Here we have the fiscal year 2009 General Fund operating budget, tax in, tax out. And in the putting it into perspective graph, the final challenge, we have a nice little snake with little dots showing us how that works. Now, after all of that, Let's look at the 2009 Comprehensive Annual Financial Report for Delaware for the year ended June 30th, 2009. We won't go through the whole report in this case. However, one page, just one page in this report says it all. On page 29 of 192 pages is the section called Statewide Financial Analysis. It states that, as noted earlier, net assets may serve over time as a useful indicator of a government's financial position. This is referring to all of the investments and holdings that the Delaware state government has been holding for many, many years. It then says that the state's assets exceeded its liabilities by $5,204,000,000 at the close of the most recent fiscal year. I'll say that again. The state's assets exceeded its liabilities by $5,204,000,000 at the close of the most recent fiscal year. These are the investments that are not talked about on the budget report. Again, we are looking at the comprehensive, meaning full, everything, all assets and holdings. The state's assets exceeded its liabilities by $5,204,000,000. It then goes on to state that the largest portion of the state's net assets, 84.4%, reflects its investment in capital assets. For example, land, buildings, vehicles, and equipment, less any related outstanding debt used to acquire those assets. And at last, it states restricted net assets, comprising 7.5% of total net assets, represents resources that are subject to external restrictions, constitutional provisions, or enabling legislation on how they can be used. In other words, it's monies invested that cannot be liquidated. The remaining portion, unrestricted net assets, at 8.1%, may be used at the state's discretion. However, some of these funds have been appropriated based on state statutes. Now, to translate this, unrestricted net assets that may be used at the state's discretion for whatever the state wants to use it for is 8.1% of $5.2 billion. Now, since I'm sure you don't have a calculator handy, 8.1% of $5,204,700,000 is $421,580,000, which may be used at the state's discretion. Well, that certainly seems to be enough to pay the $84 million budget gap for fiscal year 2009 as reported on the Delaware state budget. So instead of using this excess $421 million, which is only 8% of total assets for fiscal year 2009 in Delaware, the governor's recommendation for the incoming governor is to trim education by another $36.4 million, plus a 3% cut to higher education, plus an 8% pay cut for state employees and the raising of taxes for residents who make more than $60,000 a year. This is the criminal extortion racket called government. This is just one example of hidden assets and expendable monies that are being used for shareholder profit instead of the fiscally responsible actions of supporting the populace of the state of Delaware. But you must remember that this is only the comprehensive annual financial report for the state government of Delaware. This does not include the hundreds or thousands of individual city, county, school district, pension fund, and other governments within the state of Delaware, which all have their own individual comprehensive annual financial reports showing other billions of dollars in investments and other assets. And you ain't seen nothing yet. Let's go on to some other CAFRs from around the country. Moving further south, and still looking at the Sunshine Review, we see here the Florida state budget. It states that Florida state analysts estimate that the state faces a budget deficit for 2011 and 2012 of approximately $2.5 billion, which is down considerably from a previous forecast of a $6 to $8 billion shortfall. The Florida State Legislature passed the fiscal year 2011 Florida state budget on April 30th, 2010, the deadline for doing so. The fiscal year 2011 budget is $4 billion larger than the prior year's state budget. $4 billion larger in 1 year. The Florida legislature struggled to plug a revenue shortfall of $3.2 billion. The budget leaves $1.4 billion in reserves. That's it, just $1.4 billion. The budget includes an increase in tobacco taxes, $1 per pack of cigarettes, and $900 million by expanding gambling. There seems to be a gambling theme as a way to fix economies. Forget producing anything, let's just have casinos. Under budget status for 2008-2009, it states as early as November of 2006, Florida had the second most foreclosures in the country, with 95,862 homes foreclosed upon in just the third quarter of that year. The Florida foreclosure rate remains 1 in 214 homes. In addition to the far-reaching effects of the mortgage crisis, Florida faces long-term budget problems as a result of a decline in its major economic engines, building, migration, and tourism, which have all declined. State revenue has declined for 3 years in a row, and the new fiscal year beginning July 1, 2009, could be the fourth. With the fall in property taxes, school districts remain underfunded. Also, Florida does not have an income tax. It relies heavily on sales tax, corporate tax, and real estate transaction taxes, which have all declined. Perhaps that's because all of the corporations moved to Delaware. Florida has a thing called the 2008 Deficit Elimination Package. The plan included increases in traffic fines of $10 for every traffic ticket issued except for speeding tickets, which went up by $25, and an elimination of 18% discount tickets for those enrolled in driver improvement courses. A suspension in the Environmental Land Program, saving $4 million and canceling $250 million in bond sales. A 10.5% cut in Medicaid payments to nursing homes, and a tax increase on nursing homes. A transfer of $400 million from a rainy day fund, leaving about $250 million in the fund. A $466 million cut in education spending, an option for school administrators to volunteer for pay cuts, and limiting the severance of teachers and administrations to 1 year. A 2% decrease in teachers' bonuses, saving the state $11 million. A 4% cut in aid to state universities and community colleges for a savings of $157 million. $700 million to be borrowed from a $1.2 billion endowment that invests money from tobacco settlements for future use on health care programs. A $9.9 million cut in the state public-private tourism agency, Visit Florida. A 5% cut in a program that helps people with developmental disabilities, including autism. But I'll bet they're still supporting vaccines. A $190 million cut in a program that helps pay for low and moderate income housing. An elimination of 1,400 state jobs, and a $3.7 million decrease in funding for cancer, cardiovascular, stroke, and pulmonary diseases. Yet not one mention of wasteful government spending.